9, 12, 10, 28, 2, 23.
This is Deep State Radio.
Welcome to the podcast for 2025, our first one, in fact. I'm Marc Polymeropoulos, and this is DSR's Above Average Intelligence Show. Today, I'm very happy to welcome as my guest, Mr. I'll say Dr. Phillips O'Brien. Phillips is a professor of strategic studies at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland, where he is joining us today, and the internet connection's working. Not on your side, by the way, but it's snowing about 10 inches in D.C. now. He is an author. He's a prolific author. His books include How the War Was Won, Air, Sea Power, and Allied Victory in World War II. Some other books, and then, of course, we'll talk about his most recent one, The Strategist, which we'll go over during the podcast. Phillips was, well, I'm not going to say when you were born. I don't know if I can say that or not, but you were brought up in Boston, Massachusetts, as I'm wearing my Red Sox shirt. So always a commonality. Graduate of Trinity College, also at Cambridge, and to be honest, I'm thrilled and honored to have Phillips on because he, frankly, is my favorite academic researcher, prognosticator, commentator on Ukraine. And so we'll spend a lot of time talking on Ukraine, but I think Phillips has taken a lot of ultimately brave, but ultimately correct positions and been a very legitimate critic, not only of course, the Russian invasion, but also of U.S. policy. And I will also say, Phillips, you have been to the Vienna Inn, which anyone who listens to this podcast knows is my second office. It is, even though it's snowed 10 inches in D.C., I'm sure it's open right now. Phillips, welcome to the show.
Great, and I hope we can discuss 2004 as well. But
that's right. Well, I could spend the entire show talking about my obsession and my refreshing on my on social media. If the Red Sox are going to sign a right-handed bat, they need Alex Bregman. And I just before this, I was looking. They open up. They're on the road. But they'll play March 31st in Baltimore, so I'm going to go to that game and probably freeze.
I've never seen a game in Camden Yards.
It's a great ballpark, and frankly, here's so now we're going to digress and talk baseball the whole time, which is actually fine. But there are some ballparks like when I went last year to Yankee Stadium, I do not wear my Red Sox garb bling. In Baltimore, you can, and they're super friendly. The fans are. They're not nasty. They don't throw stuff at you. It's a great ballpark. It's easy to get to. The food is fantastic. And so hopefully the Red Sox are going to challenge the Orioles, maybe for the wild card in the AL East. But anyway,
I love your optimism. I just
got to.
Yeah, I love the optimism.
And there's this kind of there's this kind of like there is a deep state. And the deep state is within the kind of the national security, chattering classes. There are some obsessive Red Sox fans. And so I have this ongoing chat with, Mike Barnacle, former, Boston Globe legendary journalist, with Joe Scarborough, with Jonathan Lemire, just about, the obsession with the Red Sox. And so, they're undefeated right now in 2025.
And they got to be better than last year.
All right, let's jump in then to Ukraine. So because I'm going to get too hyped up about the Red Sox season. You have a Substack, which I really, we call it a Substack, right? Yeah. Which I really recommend to folks. It's a medium in which people can really dive in, and your recent one, and I believe you send it out weekly, sometimes more. But you talk not only about kind of the future of Ukraine, but there's for Ukraine under the new U.S. administration. I think we can dive into that. But let's jump into first a critique that you've had, and I totally agree with you, and we've kind of howled together on this. But in terms of where the U.S. policy kind of went astray, where a country, the United States, which has provided 60, 70 billion in aid, still never did enough. Talk to us about your critique of that and kind of this subplot, which I think is really important. And I'm not sure how history is ultimately going to judge this administration.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think history will be terribly kind to the administration. It is interesting that in the last few days, they've really started to try and fight the historical fight more than the actual policy fight. But what happened, I think, is it started from the beginning. And they simply didn't believe in February 2022 that Ukraine had a chance. That's clear now. I mean, it's been clear from what we heard in intelligence briefings at the time, but it's clear inside the Bob Woodward book. which quotes Biden saying, "Oh, I've got to deal with Ukraine being swallowed by Russia." So they just didn't view Ukraine as a real power, I think, or as a serious power. On the other hand, they viewed Russia as a great power. Russia was a very strong, powerful nation that deserved respect. And I don't think they've fully recalibrated to adjust to what we have seen from that point of view, because that would have them admit that they were fundamentally wrong. Look, this administration and all administrations don't like to admit they're wrong. Okay, everyone tries to pretend that they were right even when they weren't. This administration had a really, I think, quite shocking example of that when Jake Sullivan rewrote his article about the Middle East. Right. They just don't want to admit they're wrong. And so what they've done is tried to, I think, operate within the paradigm of their mindset in February 2022, which was ultimately, let's manage this war. Ukraine's really not going to win it. Russia is powerful. On the other hand, they also don't want to destabilize Russia there. They come from a foreign policy tradition which is based upon de-escalation and stability, as if these things, again, can be managed. I don't think they can be managed in the way they think. And so they went into the war looking at it as something to be controlled, not something to be won. And by the way, I think that's also a particularly American issue now, because there have been a number of lost wars. Right. So America has sort of lost the faith that wars can be won. Actually, wars can be won, but the U.S. does not know how to do it, or does not know how to go about winning a war. And that's a question for another point. So what I think they've done is they've tried to manage it from that point of view. It really is what I call a Goldilocks strategy, where they give Ukraine enough to fight and do damage, but not enough to threaten Russia, in their mind, to threaten Putin, because they don't want to threaten Putin. Clearly, they do believe in a nuclear, or did believe that there was a nuclear threat chance, though the percentage is all over the place. That in the Woodward book, they talked about a 50% chance of nuclear usage in the fall of 2022. Blinken in his interviews the other day talked about 5 to 15%. So they're playing fast and loose with the percent and what they thought. But clearly they thought there was a nuclear threat, though they haven't seemed to adjust to the fact that there almost certainly won't be a nuclear usage. So I think it's more an entrenched mindset that they're dealing with, and it's led them to fight this war in what I think is a terrible way, and a really tough way on Ukraine. They have wasted a lot of Russian assets, but they've also wasted a lot of Ukrainian lives, that they've caused Ukraine to fight a very bloody frontline war. And Russia, can win. Russia might be able to outlast Ukraine if that's the way they're made to fight. And I think that ultimately, to me, is the great problem of what we've seen. And when it comes to the aid, I think everyone quotes these figures, 60 billion, 70 billion. That's what we might call the market replacement value of what they have sent to Ukraine. That, in other words, if they send an old Bradley that's been in the desert for 10 years, they're going to charge that Bradley at the cost of a brand new spanking Bradley to put in the U.S. Army, not the actual cost of that Bradley after 10 years of work. So the actual amount of aid given in real value terms is considerably less. Right. Than the headline figure that's been used.
I think, there's how can I say this? For those of us who are, I think, rightly concerned about the incoming Trump administration and what their policy to Ukraine will be, it's always been, I think, a bit difficult, because while we can offer a pretty severe critique of the Biden strategy, it still might be infinitely better than whatever happens under Trump. But I think it is important to separate the two. And Phillips, you make a good point, because we've done this before. I mean, I have to be careful on how I say this. And I think, the CIA's Publication Review Board did actually clear me to what I'm going to say right now. But I recall during the Syria campaign, when a senior 7th floor CIA official said, look, we just need to give them enough to get to the negotiating table. This is the Syrian rebels with Bashar al-Assad a decade ago. And I thought that was terribly immoral, because you're never allowing an ally, whether it's an indigenous force, a group you maybe control or not, but you never allow them to win. And for me, as a practitioner, this always was problematic, because I would be in the past the one sitting next to the Ukrainians or the Syrians or the Kurds or the Afghans, and the list goes on. And ultimately, and I remember I've had arguments with folks saying you're too connected because of that, and I said, well, that's because there's a human factor here. So I've spent the last year or 2 years in XYZ country, promising the United States would come to the rescue, and now we're not going to. And you see, in essence, this happened in some ways yet again, because perhaps in some ways I'm biased as a practitioner, but I mean, this is just this is Groundhog Day again for me. I see so many parallels. But let's go to then. So understanding that this was the strategy, and I think you've laid out very clearly that it was. There has to be a question on why. So who in the administration, whether it's the National Security Council, maybe it's President Biden as someone with 50 years of experience and believes he knows Russia, Soviet Union and Russia more than others, but it was based on a theory of Russia still being a great power. Talk about that a little bit, because fundamentally a flawed policy is based on something.
It's certainly, I mean, obviously we don't know the politics within the administration, or I don't know it terribly well, but this has to be Biden. And I think actually from what I have heard in my Washington experience, which is not nearly as advanced as yours, is that Biden said very early on, I don't want a nuclear war, so make sure there's nothing that could cause a nuclear war, as if there was going to be a nuclear war when there wasn't. So he right away approached it, I would say, as a dove of the Cold War. People sometimes, I think, falsely compare Biden with John McCain and think because they were friends, that they were similar. But they were actually very different on the Cold War. Biden was a real dove in the 1980s, in the early 1980s. When he rises to prominence, he's on the left wing of the Democratic Party. And I think what we are seeing here is that same kind of ideology about what was then the Soviet Union transferred to Russia. We have to find a way to get along. It's too dangerous to have a bad relationship. Reagan was bad to sort of threaten Soviet nuclear dominance. All of that was Biden's position, sort of stock position of the 1980s. And it has transferred almost seamlessly to the view of Russia that seemed to come out of the administration now, which is ultimately we need to find a way to get along. We don't want to threaten them too much. We don't want to affect their stability. So my guess is it is Biden. Right. It was probably complicated by the fact that Biden has been slowing. I know as much as Biden's supporters don't want to admit that, probably got an entrenched idea relatively early, 22, 23, wasn't going to change. This was reinforced from the people around him. I mean, you hear, like I do, it tends to be Sullivan, Lloyd Austin, and Blinken maybe a little bit more of a hawk than anyone else, but that Sullivan and Austin, particularly Sullivan, were very happy with the Biden policy and pushing it.
So, perhaps his legacy then is someone who was partly the savior of Ukraine, and then partly to blame for Ukraine never, when I say never winning or never doing as much or being in a position as much to regain territory. But then let's now shift to what's next. And, in some ways, I think you and I are certainly some of our friends and colleagues who we kind of share some discussion chats with, have talked, quite a bit about all the delays in assistance. And, what did we joke? We were part of the Attackums lobby. I can't tell you how many TV hits I did when I was howling about Attackums, and I would see people across, the host of the shows rolling their eyes. But of course, we were right every single time. Yep. But let's switch now to the victory of Donald Trump and the incoming administration. We're talking weeks away. First of all, I want to get your overall take on does this matter right now? I think the answer to that is probably yes. But then, how will it matter? And the worst thing to do is kind of make some predictions. But honestly, and you certainly know, my catastrophizing on this, and I'm probably way kind of off the deep end on that. But what's your thoughts?
I hope I'm wrong, Mark. My thoughts are I hope I'm wrong because I'm a pessimist.
Okay, you share my catastrophizing.
Well, who does actually have? First of all, what do we know about Trump? We have to start with, if we say Biden's responsible for Biden's policy, ultimately Trump is going to be responsible for Trump's policy. Right. He's going to provide the ultimate leadership. And my guess is he's going to be more assertive this term than the first term because he now feels, I think, emboldened. Well, the one thing we can say about Trump is he has never criticized Putin.
Right.
At no point has he actually criticized the invasion and what Putin has done. He said, oh, it's a disaster, it's bloody and all of that. But he's never said, this is wrong and Russia should not have done it. And he also seems to like Putin. On the other hand, he's been quite scathing about Zelensky. So his instincts, from what we can tell, are pro-Putin, anti-Zelensky. And he's very personal. So that's why the basic pessimism is there. And then if you look at the group around him, and believe me, I'm not a Trump whisperer. I don't know the insides and outsides of the Trump administration. But it does seem to be the ones that have authority with him are more benign towards Putin. And that would be Don Jr., J.D. Vance, Tucker Carlson, that group, which really, Elon Musk, who spend the most time with him,
Right.
are actually, wouldn't have they criticized Putin? If anything, they criticize Zelensky much
Right.
more. They criticize Ukraine much more. And so there are some voices like Kellogg, General Kellogg, who, by the way, is over 80 years old. So we have to be somewhat question.
And by the way, criticized the Ukrainian special operation when they assassinated a general in Moscow, which I thought was a really bad sign of things to come.
Well, the pro-Ukraine voices around Trump are less pro-Ukraine than the Biden people.
Yeah.
That's what I think. That when you look at the Kellogg peace plan, Kellogg wrote a peace plan this summer, which you can go read. It's all there. He talks about a 20-year moratorium on Ukraine and NATO. So definitely keep them out 20 years. Aid only if Ukraine agrees to a ceasefire.
Right.
So it's basically less than the Biden policy. And these are the pro-Ukrainian voices. So I know, and you and I know a number of people who we chat with who believe it will be better because they will say Putin will antagonize Trump. He won't do what Trump wants. Trump will get his dander up. That, to me, I'd love that to be right, but I don't see any evidence of it yet.
And Trump has come out against the long-range strikes. Again, the use of ATACMS, and I guess there seems to me to be wishful thinking. I guess you can say, who knows? It remains to be seen. I for one still have kind of PTS over Helsinki, which I believe was 2018.
He's going to try to enforce a ceasefire. That I think we can say. That seems to be his plan. So you freeze the battle line, and which by the way is why Kursk is a real problem, because the Ukrainians still hold a bit of Russia, which Trump was never counting on.
And they're at it again. I think the reports of the last 24, 36 hours are
they're trying
smart.
They're absolutely trying to upend the apple cart in the strategic calculation. But I think what Trump is probably going to do is say, okay, freeze the line. So Putin gets to keep his blood-soaked farm fields that he's conquered. But then the crucial thing is Ukraine gets no guarantees for that. So you freeze the line. Sorry, Ukraine, you're not in NATO. Yeah, you'll get a little aid, probably less aid than the U.S. has been giving under Biden. And it's like, okay.
Well, and there's in terms of the guarantees, what could be on the table, which I don't think would ever be, would be, essentially joining NATO or European troops on the ground. Yep. And both of those, I see very little chance at all. So let me switch on. Let's switch to Europe for a second. Because, again, I think this certainly has been part of the kind of the Trump MAGA argument is that this is Europe's issue, cause, have at it. And so where is European leadership on this, or European unity? Because I think the signs on this, well, every once in a while, Macron says something that is somewhat inspiring, maybe a bit theatrical, but it's never backed up with anything. And so, where is European leadership or unity that could give anyone a sense that Europe could offer those security guarantees that the U.S., unfortunately, under kind of this new isolationist Trump MAGA world, the U.S. won't be able to do.
This is going to give me a headache, Mark. Yeah. Because this is one area where I don't want to say I had hope for Europe a year ago, but at least a year ago, you were sort of looking around, and people in Europe were saying, "This is a real problem. Ukraine matters to us." That Macron was saying, "Oh, we need to consider sending troops in." That. We can't trust the United States. We're not quite sure what happens if, for God forbid, Trump wins another time. So there seemed to be some realization that Europe needed to look after itself more. Actually, the election of Trump, if anything, has shown how hollow that was.
Right.
That what has happened is that the Europeans simply cannot imagine a security world without the USA. I really don't think that's in their mental mindset now. So instead, what they're doing is all desperately trying to court Trump. And that's bad for Ukraine because Trump is going to not want them to send troops into Ukraine. And this is where NATO can actually not only be a vehicle to keep Ukraine out, it could be used as a vehicle to weaken Ukraine. Because Trump can say, you want us in NATO, don't you send troops to Ukraine.
Well, then that's everything gets kind of thrown up in the air at that point. But I share your skepticism, or I guess we share your disappointment. Although I will say, over the summer when I was in Europe, I talked to someone from a NATO country, kind of one of their serious foreign policy thinkers, and he said, "Look, there's no chance of any kind of European unity on this," and he wished that there would be. Yeah. But let's let one more piece on Ukraine that I think it's important as well. And this, for those of us, particularly yourself, who's been so eloquent on this, this might be a bit of the not painful, but maybe required. What about, is there a valid critique of Ukrainian leadership and strategy here? I think it's hard for us to talk about this because we spend so much time pushing the Ukrainian cause. I mean, we just do. But they're not blameless on a lot of this as well.
No, I mean, Zelensky is sort of a fascinating war leader because he's quite inspirational, but he's also a centralizer and doesn't want to give up control and seems to like what we call yes men. So it's not the level of talent around him, I think, is quite mixed. And he has not brought in reforms to the Ukrainian military in a way that you would have hoped.
Right.
So it's not that everything's bad in the Ukrainian army, and people go way overboard on this. The Ukrainian army just is a mixed bag. There's some great brigades, and there's some really poor brigades. And it often is very dependent on who the commander is. And sometimes incompetent commanders seem to get promoted, but sometimes there's some brilliant commanders. So it's a very mixed bag, but what there hasn't been is a thorough, I think, root and branch attempt to raise efficiency across the board in the Ukrainian military. So I think that's absolutely a Ukrainian problem. Though, as always, I think we have to put this into a lot of the criticisms are because we don't talk about the Russian army, what's really going on. Right. I mean, the Russian army is probably the most overrated army in modern history. Right. And we just see what the Ukrainians did in Kursk is something that is beyond the capability of the Russian military. Both the August invasion and even the attack yesterday, from what we can tell, is something the Russians would be unable themselves to execute.
If you were sitting at the table with Zelensky and you had an opportunity to give advice that would be taken, is the conscription issue still one that is plaguing them? Do they have enough manpower? I mean, you see so much written about this. As a critique,
I think that is partly true, but also partly overstated. The problem they have is they need properly equipped brigades. Right. Just adding guys with rifles is not going to win the war for Ukraine, because if they're forced to fight a frontline war that we see now, which is this sort of blood-soaked bash back and forth, the Russians are going to take a big toll on them because they have glide bombs, they have air superiority, certain things. So I'm not sure adding 50,000 soldiers to the Ukrainian army without better equipment, without giving them long-range strike, is probably not going to change the dynamic of the war. That's why ultimately I think what we have to do is give them the ranged advantage. The attack, we give them ATACMS, but say they can't use them in Russia, and then don't give them that many. We force them to fight in a way we would never fight. I think that's the frustrating thing to me, is if the U.S. would ever not take the ranged advantage, and and would not try to fight a First World War kind of trench warfare. The United States would never do this, but we're therefore saying to Ukraine, you should do this, whereas not allowing them. So it might be, if there would be a quid pro quo, you could say, okay, yes, Ukraine, you conscript, but we'll give you the weapons to win. But what we're doing now is the opposite. We're not going to give you the weapons to win, but you go ahead and conscript.
One of the things that this reminds me of is so much of in my career, again, working with indigenous groups, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and others, we have imperfect allies, and that's okay. I remember
we are imperfect ourselves.
we are imperfect ourselves, but so there is a valid critique of the Ukrainians, but it's also you go to battle with kind of the allies and the groups that you have, and they're not perfect. Again, neither are we. But I agree with you. Sometimes this is overblown a bit because it also, in some ways, is an excuse for kind of U.S. missteps. I think,
and also the key thing about allies, and you have dealt with allies. The most important thing in an ally is a willingness to fight.
Yeah.
If you don't have the willingness to fight, you're pretty useless as an ally.
Well, this happened in Afghanistan. I mean, look, I ran one of our paramilitary bases along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border for a year. So there was 10 Americans at 1,000 Afghan indigenous allies, and they were fantastic. That ratio is pretty remarkable when you think about it. 10 Americans, 1,000 indig. I remember one of the commanders of ISAF, a U.S. 3 or 4 star, came to visit me, and I said, "Welcome to the finest fighting force in Eastern Afghanistan." And he looked around. He said, "Where are our guys?" I said, "Right, exactly." Yet, I also made the argument always that we couldn't leave. Mm-hmm. So there's just 10 of us, and these are it is an incredible resource, an incredible piece of the arrow in our quiver. Yet they couldn't operate on their own, and you have to accept that fact. And I remember with when Afghanistan fell apart. Well, a lot of it I think had to do with, and if this is not a Biden bashing episode, but if you remember, President Biden at some point came out and said, "We're not going to supply air power anymore, air cover." The Afghan military, then they crumbled. Well, of course they crumbled. It's over because morale is a huge component in conflict. But let me, Phillips, I could talk to you all day. Before we get to the bonus content, and I want just all the listeners to hear a little bit about your book, The Strategist. And so I love giving guests the opportunity to plug their books. It is on Amazon, of course. It is very well received. Let's see, as a Wall Street Journal, I got to get my glasses. The Wall Street Journal review: the narrative moves briskly by linking decisions to identifiable personality traits. The Strategist provides insights into the minds of titans who vied for Europe's destiny. I love that quote. So tell us about the book.
Yeah, it came about because I've been writing about Second World War grand strategy for a while. And I wrote How the War Was Won, which might be the most boring book written about the war, because it's all about statistics and manufacture and production and logistics. But then it also talked a bit about Roosevelt, Hitler, Churchill, and them. And I became interested into the decisions they were making and why they were making those decisions. And the more I looked at it, the more it was interesting is that they all came out of the First World War. That all of them had different roles. I mean, Churchill and Hitler had been at the front. Mussolini had been at the front. Stalin had fought in the Russian Civil War and Russian Revolution at the end of the First World War. And Roosevelt had served in Woodrow Wilson's cabinet as Assistant Secretary of the Navy and actually gone and visited the front. So they all had these really intense experiences of the First World War. And they all, you might say the First World War created them as thinkers, as strategic thinkers. So I thought it would be really interesting to go back and to look at those sort of 5 parallel experiences. How did they experience war as younger men? How did it shape them? What did they think about the smells, the sounds, the equipment? And then having established that, say, okay, then let's see what happens when they have these moments in the Second World War when they have to decide things, either together as allies when Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin meet, or in opposition, when Churchill and Hitler fight in the Battle of Britain. And it was, I think, more and more interesting to see how the First World War is playing out in their minds in the second, how their history comes. And the other thing that I think why I really enjoyed writing the book is I think we are too afraid to talk about policymakers and leaders. We like to talk about theories, realism. Powers do something. And in fact, much of the academic world is to downplay individuals. Be it a Marxist theory, it's about class, or a realist, it's about power, or escalation theory, it's about perceptions. Whereas actually, when you come down to it, it's a small group of people making decisions. And we don't like to admit that, but Franklin Roosevelt makes really important decisions. Hitler makes the decision to go to war in 1939. And actually, I think we've gone too far the other way by downgrading individuals. And we can see that, by the way. Putin made the decision to invade Ukraine.
Right.
That was his decision with a small group of advisors. That didn't have to happen. And so I wanted to bring the personal back to the decision-making of the Second World War. And that was how the book came about.
Let me ask one quick question. Is now you've piqued my interest, because leadership is something that I have followed, I've written about. I certainly kind of geek out on this. Your greatest leader in, let's say, in our lifetime.
In our lifetime?
In our lifetime.
Wow, that's a great question.
Or you could say World War II forward.
Yeah, I mean, see, the people ask me, like, I'll start with World War II, because people say, who is the best grand strategist? And I always say it depends what you mean. So, like, I would say Roosevelt was the best on the ways and means, but wasn't the greatest on the ends. I'm not sure Roosevelt knew what the war was about. He wanted to win it, and he wanted the United States to be done, but he had a very sort of nebulous view of the post-war world, as if we would get along. We'll all get along with Stalin, and all will be fine.
Right.
So he didn't have a great vision of the post-war world, but he was by far the best, I would argue, in the ways and means. I'm going to win this war by crushing the Japanese and Germans through air power, keep our casualties down. The United States loses fewer soldiers in the Second World War than Russia would lose in a few weeks, because of the way Roosevelt fights. So in many ways, Roosevelt had this extraordinary success, but also didn't make a lot. Who would be the best? That's a really good question. I mean, what's interesting to me, I'm going to talk about American presidents. I actually think the late 80s through the 90s, and that's Reagan, Bush, and Clinton, are all actually quite, in my mind, quite highly rated, because they understood the limits of American power. And whereas that came off, I have to say we've had disastrous presidents since 2000.
Okay, right.
Yeah, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden have not understood, I think, the proper limits of American power. They've either overreacted or underreacted. If something like, when Bush Sr. stops the invasion of Iraq and says, okay, I don't want to go to Baghdad. I don't need to go to Baghdad. That actually was a really smart decision, I would say. And when Reagan actually finds a way to work with Gorbachev, takes advantage of the fact that he had this military buildup, but then actually uses it to try and get what he wants. And even Clinton, people are sometimes hard on Clinton, but Clinton makes some very interesting policy choices on how far to go at Kosovo.
Right, particularly in the Balkans, yeah.
Yeah, gets what he wants. So I actually quite like the late 80s through 90s foreign policy. That, to me, and maybe that's because they come out of the Cold War and they understand certain things.
Interesting.
And
Well, giddy up for 2025. So, look, unfortunately, this is the point in the podcast where we have to say goodbye to our guests who are not yet subscribers. If you want to listen to the rest of this podcast and all of our other shows in full, just go to the dsrnetwork.com and click on membership. It's only $7 a month, and it brings you a lot of great bonus content. So if you're not a subscriber, we hope you will be soon. And if you are one, stand by. We will be right back with Phillips O'Brien.